therapy and neuropsychological assessment to people of all ages, all backgrounds, and all psychological concerns. You can see our clinicians there at the bottom in that lineup. That's me, Natasha Brown, Rebecca Abbott Sinclair, Sam Janit, Maddie Lawler, Nav Gill, Cecilia Barbosa, Megan Moxie, Ben Janitis, Olga Fuller, Amira Hanna, and Danielle DeFilippo. We all have experience working with people across the lifespan, but we also have special training and experience to work with kids and parents using evidence-based assessment and treatment. I have a background in clinical research and neuropsychological assessment. I got my PhD at Suffolk University in Boston, and I also have an MBA from Suffolk as well. I did my postdoctoral fellowship and early career work at NYU School of Medicine, where I studied the neuroscience of schizophrenia in teens and adults, and then switched to studying family and parent treatments of interpersonal violence and hostility at home. I opened Small Brooklyn Psychology as a solo assessment practice in 2013, and I started growing it as a group of neuropsychologists and therapists in 2018. So we just celebrated our 10th anniversary. I do assessment for people of all ages, but lately I've been specializing in developmental assessments for toddlers because there are actually very few people who do that. But one of my main goals at Small Brooklyn is to be a resource to the community. And whether you work with us directly or not, we do what we can to offer mental health knowledge and suggestions and connections to providers. One of the ways that we do this is through webinars with our long-term partner, Park Slope Parents. Thank you very much, Park Slope Parents. Park Slope Parents are the originals in helping to get good supportive information out to families in Brooklyn. We've developed a lot of webinars across over the past few years across many different areas of psychology, from tips on managing behavior at home and in a classroom, to what a neuropsychological evaluation is and how it helps, to how to understand mental health issues in children and adults, and how you as parents can take care of yourself. Most of these talks are available for free on our website at smallbrooklyn.com/services/talks. So that brings me to today's talk on marijuana in teens. I wanted to make sure that everybody knows that I am not a substance abuse expert. We don't even really have the ability to treat active substance abuse at Small Brooklyn. But I've been really alarmed in the past few years seeing research that is coming out that shows specific long-term negative effects when teens smoke pot. At the same time, as marijuana has become decriminalized across the country, it's become more accessible, but not well regulated, especially with how much THC is in weed products. And we'll talk about that more in a bit. And I was hearing a lot from teens and parents alike, this perception that it is harmless and it is no big deal. So despite me not being an expert, I found it important to talk about. Susan, can you make sure that the talk is recording? I wasn't sure if I saw that come up.
We're all good.
Awesome. And so because my friend, Dr. Julie Blitzer, is an expert on prevention in teens, I asked her to join me and to share her expertise as well. Julie Blitzer, PhD, is a clinical psychologist who's worked with adolescents and families for over a decade. She's currently the outreach and prevention psychologist at New York-Presbyterian at their school-based health center, consisting of 7 Article 28 primary care clinicians. They serve approximately 7,500 public school students in 21 schools in Upper Manhattan and the Bronx. She's also an assistant clinical professor of medical psychology and psychiatry at Columbia University at the medical center. Julie has been part of the NYP school-based team since 2012, where she started as a mental health provider at the program's largest site, serving 7 schools at the John F. Kennedy campus. After 5 years in a clinical role and a brief leave, she returned to the program to establish a new role to get dedicated to universal mental health interventions and outreach in 2019. So she works with parents, students, and school staff to increase mental health literacy and access to support services through workshops, health messaging, and consultation. So Julie and I are going to trade off portions of the talk, and Susan will be monitoring the Q&A box as we go. Thank you, Susan. If you have any questions, please chat them to Susan in the Q&A box, and Julie and I will save some time at the end to answer as many of them as we can. So take it away, Julie, and I'm going to figure out how to advance to the next slide.
Perfect. Thank you all for being here. This is very exciting that I get to work with Mandi again. We're old friends, and it's really fun to reconnect. Thank you, Susan and Park Slope Parents as well for inviting me. So let's get rolling.
Sorry, Julie. Okay, there we go.
Okay, so we're going to start with a little quiz. You guys aren't going to give your answers, but we wanted to sort of make the start a little more engaging and a little more fun. So, and these are facts that you may or may not know. Some are going to be a little surprising, I think, but let's go for it. Okay, true or false? Marijuana is addictive. This is in fact true. 1 to 3 out of every 10 marijuana users will become addicted. This is very similar to the rates in alcohol. If somebody starts in adolescence in their teen years, this rate goes up to 1 in 6. And those rates are similar to cocaine addiction. And then also 1 in 3 adolescents use marijuana who use marijuana weekly become dependent. So marijuana is certainly addictive psychologically and also physiologically. Okay, true or false? The effect that marijuana has on the brain is the same for adults and teens. As you may have guessed, and what we will be talking about later is that that is false. When teens use marijuana early and they use it often, this can lead to significant negative long-term impact on brain development, motivation, and mental health. But studies also suggest that if there's an occasional user, an adult user, who has started in adulthood, there is very minimal long-term impact. So it is very different. True or false? Marijuana is safe because it's natural. That is false. We know a lot of things in nature are natural, quote unquote, but they are not safe for human consumption. And in fact, some things could actually kill you. Arsenic, Jimson weed, things are very toxic to human beings. And marijuana is, yes, grown, as is tobacco, right? But both are not safe for human consumption. All right, true or false? Marijuana use among teenagers in the United States has increased 145% since the year 2000. That seems like a lot. It is, but it's actually more. In fact, use has increased 245%. Why? I think we have some ideas. There's much greater accessibility now since legalization across the country. There's still a perception that marijuana is very safe to do, even though there are things we're going to talk about today that tell us the contrary. There's increased ways of using marijuana, including edibles and vaping. So there's more sort of availability and more ways to use and more ways to hide use. And also, people in general, but teens especially, are feeling particularly stressed out from the fallout of the pandemic and other things. And so there's increased anxiety and depression and hence self-medication with marijuana. True or false? Smoking marijuana is safer than smoking cigarettes. This is the one that's usually pretty surprising for people, whether I'm talking to teens or adults. Marijuana, in fact, as a substance, if you burn it, burns hotter than tobacco. And this means it's impacting the protective lining of our lungs in a more profound way. We also, people who use marijuana and smoke marijuana tend to hold it in their lungs for longer periods of time than they do cigarette smoke, which also impacts the lungs more profoundly than cigarette smoke. And there's about 3 to 10 times the tar of tobacco and 4 times greater tar retention in the lungs. Also surprising that 50 to 75% of the carcinogens in tobacco and cigarettes are present in marijuana, smoked marijuana. And the airflow obstruction of one joint is comparable to that of 5 tobacco cigarettes. Okay, true or false? Smoking marijuana is safer than drinking alcohol. Okay, so we'll talk about potency. We've already mentioned it a couple of times or alluded to it, but marijuana right now is very high potency. It's very different than it was 20 years ago. So high potency marijuana smoked in high doses can cause acute psychosis. People can make very, very poor decisions when on high potency marijuana and can get into accidents or make decisions about taking their own life as well. There are syndromes associated with cannabis and that there can be very serious implications, like serious bouts of vomiting. And this is for people who even use marijuana heavily for a very long time. So there's a lot of medical impact that we're going to talk about. Vaping is also associated with a specific kind of lung injury, EVALI, that can be acute and it can be actually deadly when you're smoking marijuana concentrates. And it's led to a lot of ER visits. Edibles have as well. And we're also seeing more marijuana being laced with different substances. On rarer occasions, it is fentanyl, but there are a lot of other substances like synthetic marijuana, K2, spice, that can really be dangerous to somebody's health if it's laced on marijuana. We will talk about fentanyl a bit as well. And we'll talk about it right now. We wanted to obviously talk about this because fentanyl is a very dangerous substance. It's also all over, right? So there was a stat that half of the illegal pills on the street are contaminated by fentanyl. The lethal dose of fentanyl is displayed here. So if this was the size of a pill, the lethal dose of fentanyl is that little grayed area there on the pill. It's very small. The amount can fit on the tip of a pencil. So it's very high potency. It's 50 times stronger than heroin, 100 times stronger than morphine. Yes, fentanyl is used in a controlled setting, in a hospital setting for pain, but it's not really the first resort, and also should never be used outside of a controlled environment. But you know, people who manufacture drugs for street use have put this medication in because it's cheaper and it gets people hooked, but it also is really responsible for a lot of the increased overdose or the rates of overdose increasing. Mandi, do you want to talk about the more recent incident?
Yeah, Susan shared with me some information that she got when she went to a meeting with the 78th precinct where local either Park Slope bodegas, I think, had been implicated in selling gummies that had been laced with fentanyl and sent 2 teens to the hospital because of it. She was also given information from a pediatrician that reported on a sexual assault in Brownsville following a fentanyl lacing in marijuana specifically. And these are just 3 incidents, which, by the way, I could not find on Google. So they're not always being reported in the news and things like that, but things are happening. And I'm sure that there are many more than that, even here in Brooklyn, than we realize.
Absolutely. And, you know, I do want to talk a little bit about the signs of overdose, just so everyone's clear about it, because this has happened. I have witnessed it happen in front of me on the street. And it's a very good idea to, at this point, for everyone to have Narcan or naloxone, which is basically the antidote to an opiate overdose. You could get it at a drugstore at this point. I think there's like maybe a small like training you have to do, and I'm not even sure if that's true anymore. But anyone could administer this to someone in need, even if you suspect it. If you give Narcan to someone who doesn't need it, it doesn't hurt them. So there's really no risk. And these are some of the common signs of overdose, like limp bodies, tiny pupils, the skin being discolored, feeling cold and clammy, not breathing or gasping for breath, things like that. So I know this is kind of scary to talk about, but I think it's very important because it's happening a lot.
Narcan is a nasal spray, right? It's not a shot. I think a lot of people think of.
Spray. And it's, I think it's like each nostril will get like 1 or 2 sort of sprays of this, and it's very easy to do. And anyone can do this to save somebody's life.
And I went to this dropthefbomb.com, which is a resource that Julie had given me. It's actually quite useful in being able to talk to teens about fentanyl. So if you want more information and more resources, you can look there.
Thank you. Just a few basics. I think most of us will probably know this information, but the scientific name is cannabis. There's many names over the years, weed, bud, hash, whatever. And kids are constantly telling me new names that I've never heard of. The psychoactive ingredient, meaning the thing that makes you high, is THC, which is tetrahydrocannabinol. We all want to know how much is too much. It's a very hard question to answer. The research differs about this. I'm going to give a rule of thumb, if you don't mind, Mandi. Heavy or regular use is probably 21 to 30 days in a month. Okay, so like almost every day or every day using. So think about it in that way. But we'll also talk about some, I want to mention some other research showing that that's emerging, showing that even subclinical marijuana use, meaning rates that aren't that high or frequency that isn't that high, can be associated with brain changes and negative outcomes. So it's not straightforward.
even just occasional use was shown to show some of the effects that we're going to talk about later in the slides were like double the rate, for example, of non-users, whereas the heavy users were showing more like 4 times the rate of non-users. But it's showing that these negative effects are happening even at occasional use. So it's important to know.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. And research is emerging around, different levels of use, especially in teens. So we'll try to keep you updated now about what's out there. Just the take-home message, really, and that we're gonna, say a number of times here, is that early use plus heavy use equals increased negative outcomes. That's the take-home message. And you all, I don't know if you know the difference between THC and CBD. THC is a psychoactive agent, so it's going to get you high. CBD is derived from marijuana, from cannabis, but it either has none or trace amounts of THC in it. So it's used for muscle pain sometimes. It is not a regulated substance as THC is. Okay, marijuana today. Very, very different. I was even told that it should be seen as a different drug than it was 20 years ago because of the potency, because of how much THC is in the marijuana that people are using now, whether it's in a bodega or a legal dispensary. This is just a graph that kind of shocked me. I wish the graph went a little higher in years, but between 1995 and 2014, this is how much the potency of marijuana has increased. And this is based on the DEA's basically collection of marijuana that they confiscated. Okay, so it keeps going up, and I would guess that the graph would continue to go up. Marijuana yeah, go ahead.
The latest studies that I showed were showing 17 and 18% THC as of last year.
There you go. So definitely up. So 3 to 6 times the concentration of THC maybe now than in the 90s. Or maybe even higher. So this potency has implications, right? It can lead to higher rates of dependency and addiction, higher rates of overdose, quote unquote, which we'll talk about, and just higher rates of negative impact. And vaping and edibles, which are newer ways of using marijuana, are becoming much more popular. And actually they represent ways of sort of hiding it better and making it more sort of casual. So they don't smell as much. It's easier to do. Easier to hide from parents, right? And
it's more attractive. Yeah. It's all being packaged in these like candy forms and packaging that looks very similar to the sorts of snacks that we already eat.
Very good point, Mandi. And we could say that also for the stores in general, right? Like they're basically cartoon characters all over the stores and graffiti and really appealing things that like young adults and adolescents and tweens want to look at and think are cool. So it's an issue. I also just wanted to make clear that there are only 11 legal dispensaries right now in New York City in the 5 boroughs, despite the fact that there's, as we see here, 8,000 plus smoke shops, weed bodegas, whatever you want to call them. And they're not being cracked down on very much. There will be one every couple of months, as you'll see on the news, but it doesn't do much to deter bodegas from selling because there are very few consequences for getting caught. So yeah, anything want to add, Mandi?
No, that's good. Thanks.
Cool. This is a chart. It's very busy, but it kind of explains the different ways of using marijuana, how it's done, how it works in your body, and some of the implications. Smoking is obviously you're heating marijuana plant and you're inhaling it, and you're doing so with a joint, a blunt, a bong, whatever you're using. This kicks in between 5 or 10 minutes very quickly, and you'll usually be high for 1 to 4 hours. Some of the issues is obviously its impact on the lungs and the carcinogens that exist in marijuana smoke, and that all the things that we sort of spoke about. The airflow obstruction is a serious issue. Also, smoked marijuana can easily be laced with any kind of substance, and things like K2 or other synthetic marijuana. It creates a very, very, very disturbing high and a medically concerning high. Vaping is done. I have read that you can vape actual plant, but most people vape a concentrate or a liquid of some kind, a liquid that's very high concentrate, right? And it'll kick in very quickly, like smoking marijuana, but it will last longer. Sometimes the high can be a lot longer, a lot more intense, and actually a lot more unpleasant. We talked about the lung injuries associated with vaping marijuana, and also the cognitive and physical problems are more profound because the concentration of THC is usually higher when vaping. And yeah, so these are very high concentrate marijuana substances that can have a really negative impact. And then finally, edibles, which is really on trend right now. Edibles, as we know, kick in a lot. It takes a lot longer for them to kick in, at least 30 to 90 minutes. They have to metabolize through our stomach and our digestive system. They have to go through the liver. There's a lot that the body has to do to kick in the high. And the problem is that often people who are novel to taking gummies don't understand that, and they take way too many gummies because they think it's not working. And this is when the risk of overdose increases. Most of the marijuana overdoses are coming from edibles. And what I mean by overdose is you do not die from marijuana, but there are cases where you have tachycardia, rapid heart rate, muscle spasms, even in your like in your chest, in your airways, and all over your body, and then some very severe mood shifts and paranoia, and even like losing consciousness. So this, I will tell you, say it again.
Hallucinations, panic attacks, sometimes hallucinations.
Absolutely. Very, very severe experiences that actually require, medical care that's emergency in nature. So going to the ER, and we've seen many at our clinics, a huge spike in kids overdosing on edibles, and we've had to, send them to the ER.
Thanks. All right, so I can talk a bit about why it is that marijuana impacts teen brains so much more dramatically than adult brains. So first, let's talk about how the human brain matures at all. One of the questions that I've seen so far is how are we defining like adults and teens, for example. Legally we say 18, so a lot of people think that the human brain stops developing at 18, but that's not actually true. The brain continues to develop until at least the mid-20s and later. So between puberty and the mid-20s, what's happening is that the gray matter, which is the top layer of the cortex, is thinning and it's stabilizing at a predictable pattern. The white matter, which is what connects the different parts of the brain and sends messages throughout your whole nervous system, that is increasing in volume. And the connections are reorganizing and becoming more myelinated, which is increasing efficiency. When we talk to kids about their brains, we call these connections highways and construction zones. When you do something over and over again, the connection strengthens and becomes more myelinated, and so it is like a super highway sending messages even faster. When you have that kind of efficiency, then it frees up brain power for doing things more like higher reasoning and critical thought. So as adults, when we are pruning things that we don't need anymore, some of those construction zones that we don't ever need to use in our lives, and we are spending more time on the myelinated connections, that is allowing us to be more efficient in our daily lives. Imaging data shows that we don't actually reach peak functional connectivity until 25 or even 30 years old. The reorganization and pruning happens from the back of the brain, which is the most ancient part of the brain, to the front of the brain. And in the front is the prefrontal cortex. That's the seat of higher reasoning and self-regulation. So that is what's finished last. A lot of people know that. You can see this graphic here that shows the differences in maturity from a 5-year-old brain to a 20-year-old brain. But the reason that teens in particular are more susceptible is because the amygdala develops before the prefrontal cortex does. The amygdala is the emotion center of the brain. And so in this graphic, for example, you can see what happens to how the amygdala works. Is you might see something fearful like a spider. Your eyes see the information. It relays the message to the visual thalamus, which sends the information back to the visual cortex, which then says, oh, that's a spider. Sends the information to the amygdala, which goes, well, that's a spider, and then sends information to your nervous system to actually do the fight or flight motion. And nowhere in this is the prefrontal cortex getting involved, which is when it might say, hey, that's just a Halloween decoration and is not, you don't have to get scared about that. That is kind of an overblown metaphor for how things might work in teens. They feel emotions really strongly and they're very reactive but they don't yet have the full power of their reasoning and restraint, which are still developing. And so it leads to more impulsivity and risk-taking. So teens are both more susceptible to use in the first place because they are impulsive and they're swayed by social pressure. They are more likely to use too much without realizing it's too much, and not just overdose in one single setting, but also over time oh, stop worrying, mom. It's not that bad. I'll be fine. I can handle it, because their brake system is not fully developed and they're not very good at monitoring their own behavior and responses to what's happening in the moment. And then because their developing brains are more prone to damage, all of that is working together to put teens at higher risk. So let's talk more specifically about how marijuana actually affects the brain. THC actually mimics the actions of certain neurotransmitters called cannabinoids. And so the neurotransmitters, their job is to send messages throughout the nervous system. And the cannabinoids are, they attach to cannabinoid receptors, which are actually found in many different sections of the brain. So marijuana's effects are actually pretty widespread. It influences systems that control pleasure, memory, reasoning, concentration, hunger and pain, movement, coordination, and sensory and time perception. So when you're high, marijuana impairs your thinking and your learning, your balance, your posture, coordination, your cognition, your cognitive and motor reaction time. This is why we're starting to see more messaging about not driving while high. There's a big push back in the 80s about don't drink and drive. We haven't seen the same message necessarily about marijuana, but it is absolutely true that you can have the same sorts of accidents and injury when driving while high. It also changes the reward system in the brain. So over time, the brain it comes to expect higher levels of dopamine, and you're not going to experience that subjective sense of pleasure from just the small hits of dopamine that you might get from day-to-day interactions. You need a bigger dopamine hit in order to feel that, and that's part of what contributes to addiction. So let's talk about what we have found about the long-term effects. This is adults who use heavily as teens. What are they reporting? Now, generally speaking, research in marijuana, especially in the US, has been minimal because marijuana has always been illegal. It's a class 1 substance. And so in some ways, our research on marijuana is like kind of in an infancy. That's why we're seeing so much more now come out. There is this box down at the bottom here actually talks about how we are now in the middle of a very well-funded, very big study of almost 12,000 teens doing longitudinal research to see what happens when you just have 12,000 kids who are living their lives. How do they compare before and after they use pot? It's called the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, and you can learn more at that link below. All right, so adults who reported heavy use in their teen years, they're more likely to have problems with problem solving, learning, attention, and memory. These are things that they're reporting in their adult lives. These are permanent changes in their functioning that have not gone away. They are less efficient at executive functioning tasks, things like planning and strategizing, making decisions, setting and completing tasks, inhibiting their impulses. And some research has started to theorize that some of this is happening because the pruning that happens in the prefrontal cortex is actually starting too early. And this is partly why this is a permanent shift. This is once things are pruned, yes, you can develop new connections, but the original connections don't come back and not in the same volume and efficiency that they did before. Adults report slower processing speed and permanent IQ loss. There have been some conflicting studies on this, some showing as much as 8 points of IQ loss, some showing more like 2 or 3. But it's important to know that these IQ scores don't fully rebound, even after you have quit. So those are all problems with cognition. Let's talk about problems with mental health. Marijuana users who started in their teens were 2 to 4 times more likely to experience other substance abuse and dependence. So the old adage about marijuana being a gateway drug is absolutely true. You are more likely to move on to other drugs and harder drugs over time. Worry, fear, and physical symptoms of anxiety, loss of pleasure, which we call anhedonia and major depressive disorder, Now, underlying depression and anxiety can lead teens to use marijuana as a form of self-medication, but some studies have actually shown that pot use preceded the significant psychiatric symptoms, giving us more confidence in saying that the pot use was actually a contributory cause to those mental health issues later on. And we also do see increases in self-harm behavior, suicidal thoughts, and suicidal behaviors, including completed suicide. And then one very important thing that we've already referenced is we've now collected a lot of data showing that people who use marijuana are more likely to then go on to psychosis, long-term psychosis over time. The prevailing theory is an epigenetic contribution, so that basically if you have a genetic vulnerability to psychosis and then you go through an environmental situation or an experience that turns that gene on, and using pot is one of those experiences that can turn the gene on, then you are in a psychotic disorder, including schizophrenia, permanently. I know that sounds very severe when I say permanently, but it's a pretty significant finding. In fact, California is now debating putting it as a warning on their legal marijuana products that may lead to psychosis.
And this is, I just want to say, Mandi, that particular point has been pretty widely studied as far as I know. And there's a very strong link there between genetic predisposition of psychosis and it actually emerging.
Great. And then just general life outcomes. We don't yet have the research to show for sure that marijuana use causes these things to happen. It may be more that marijuana users find themselves in situations that make these scenarios more likely to occur. We also don't know if it's about chronic use. So for example, when you use marijuana, the deficits that you experience from being high can last days or weeks. So if you were using it even just a couple of times a week, you might be chronically experiencing reduced functioning. So we don't know if the effects are due to that or if they're due to just long-term effects from ever having used marijuana. But regular use is associated with less educational achievement. So people are less likely to graduate high school or to ever go to college. Less academic motivation, which I'm sure is contributing to the educational achievement. Lower income in jobs, lower credit scores and savings, greater unemployment. Less social support, as well as relationship problems and loneliness. Lower life satisfaction. And then some European studies are also showing some excess years, life years lost as well. So a lower life expectancy for women at 12 years and men at 15. So let's shift now to talking about how do you talk to your teens? Now that we've given you all of this terrible doom information. Julie.
Terrible but important information, and actually ever evolving. So I'm very glad we're talking about this, and
That's right.
We'll try to give updates when we can, if anything else emerges. But this is really important because there are some effective ways to talk to your kid about these things. You know your kid best, you know how to communicate with them, but these are sort of some tips that we can recommend in terms of having these discussions or approaching your child about their marijuana use. Starting early, I would say starting in the preteen years, even before teenage years, having discussions. I would say that connect you well to your kid. This is very obvious, and we all try to do this, but having this strong foundation throughout your child's life, from when they're a toddler to the teenager, is very important. And that means, letting them know that they can tell you anything, letting them know that they won't be in trouble for telling you something that you might not like, letting you sort of not leading with punishment in certain situations. There's a whole host of parenting approaches, but establishing that connection is incredibly important, and doing that early, whether it's discussions about marijuana or anything else. And then obviously modeling good coping skills yourself, and making sure you are showing your kid how to take care of themselves, right? You're doing things like taking time for yourself or exercising, attempting not to self-medicate too much with drugs or alcohol. And I strongly believe that using in front of your kid marijuana is probably a very big sign to them that they can use as well. So being really conscious of how you're using, if you are using, whether that goes for alcohol or marijuana or any other drug. Mandi, do you want to expand on any of that?
Yeah, just there will always be rules that apply to adults that don't apply to kids or vice versa. There will always be things that adults can do that kids can't do. And it's not to say that that is the message that we're sending to kids. But the more familiarity that they are experiencing with it in the home, the more the less trepidation, intimidation they're going to feel about it on their own. So just know it's always part of the calculus. Continuing on this starting early strategy, if you can talk factually, basically giving this presentation or some form of it to teens will give them the information that they need so that when they experience marijuana or encounter marijuana the first time, they will already have the information that tells them this isn't really something I want to mess with. It's forewarned is forearmed. And then I would also encourage you to openly discuss substance abuse in your family history. If you have family members that have experienced addiction, one, you can tell your kids about their genetic predisposition, because the more genetic history that you have of addiction, the higher risk they are for developing addiction themselves. And if you're comfortable, you can also talk about the negative outcomes that family member experienced through their addiction. And that can also give them some real world personal experience with what can happen, even from people who think gonna be fine, I can handle it, whatever it was. And then also clearly discuss your values and rules. It's okay if you don't want them to use marijuana. It's okay to say, I don't want you to use marijuana. You can remind them that this is still an illegal substance up until 21. You can say that this does not align with our family values. But if you are going to say it, you have to say it concretely. So don't use vague directives like be smart or be good, because that doesn't clearly communicate what it is that you want them to be smart or good about.
As we know, teens and young adults, and actually anyone, no one likes to feel embarrassed or humiliated. And this is especially true in the teenage years when your peers' opinions are the most relevant and what others think of you is very important. So finding ways, having discussions about if your kid does not want to use, how to say no in certain situations can be a real savior for them. Ways that don't embarrass them, ways that let them avoid, maybe ways that sort of blame you for it, like, oh, my mom's going to smell it or something like that. Right, exactly. My mom's a bloodhound, or my coach really doesn't want me to do this. He's like super serious. I'll get kicked off the team, whatever. But also, you know, if they had a bad experience, or even if they need to make up a bad experience, right? Like, oh, this really, like, it made me super sick. I can't do it. Like, it's not cool. It doesn't feel good to me. Just having those lines ready for when they encounter those situations can be very, very important and can give them sort of a lot of power in a situation where they may feel pressured. And also maybe deciding on a code word. If they text you that code word, you know that they need some help, or they need you to call them, so you can sort of go to the side and they can explain what's happening or just get out of the situation. So sort of scheming a little bit about how to get out of uncomfortable situations can be really helpful for teenagers.
Yeah, similar to, you know, the code word that a friend might send on a bad date, like, how do my grandmother died, or, you know, a parent can invent some sort of terrible excuse, or maybe they can be the like monster on the side or whatever that would help the teens get out of a bad situation without having to lose face in front of their friends. Once they're in the teen years and you, whether you suspect they're using marijuana or not, it's important to just talk with them, gather information as much as you can. So talk neutrally and non-judgmentally. That's really the bottom line. So find non-threatening opportunities to talk with them. Remember, your goal is about gathering information, ask what do they know about marijuana, and then correct some of their assumptions if they're wrong. Ask what their friends are doing and how they're approaching drugs. That can be like an indirect way of getting around to what your teen is actually doing. If they have used it and they admit to it, you can ask why they used it and how they used it. Sometimes as much information that you can get about whether it's because they are trying to cope with anxiety, or they're trying to fit in with their friends, or they're trying to avoid, thinking about something terrible. That gives you then more information about how to help them in the future. When you talking in the car or while walking is sometimes more comfortable because it's a side-by-side conversation instead of face-to-face. It's less intimidating. And then don't drone on and lecture about this. Plan on like 3 to 5 minute short talks about this multiple times over years if you need to, starting, in their tween years if you can. But just remember that you only have a certain amount of time before they zone out.
And also, recognizing your own anxiety about the discussion, and making sure you sort of mentally prepare for having it, calming yourself, maybe doing some breathing, because it's easy to sort of get carried away and start lecturing and start overprotecting in these situations when you feel strongly about a topic and as it pertains to like the safety of your kid. So it's hard, but the approach does matter. So also sort of, being able to not approach things with punishment or be feeling discouraged or disappointed. You may feel those ways, but it's not helpful for your child to hear that. They really probably just want to have an ear to talk things out, and be able to come to you as a person who will sort of support them and work through something instead of tell them what to do, even though we'll probably have a strong urge to do so. And then sort of understanding, their motivations, why they're doing it, like Mandi said, but also reflecting that back to them. Like, it sounds like you're using because you're pretty anxious at school, or it sounds like you're using because you just broke up with, whoever. Just being able to acknowledge that their reasons are legitimate and you're there to listen.
If your teen has started using marijuana, and you want to talk about helping them to stop, sometimes teens totally tune out when parents start talking about stopping altogether because they feel like it's just not realistic in their life. Like, oh, you don't know, everyone's doing it, and basically all of their social circle and social time might be around using marijuana. So if you feel like your teen won't or can't stop using marijuana, then your first step might be to focus on reducing harm. That's not the end goal, but it is maybe the first step. And then maybe you can help reduce use over time. So some of these harm reduction strategies might be that they'll agree that they'll call you to pick them up when they're high and you won't punish them. They won't take physical risks when they're high, like driving or swimming in the ocean or walking alone. They won't use high potency THC products. They'll use fentanyl test strips. And they'll agree to get involved in other activities, things that might eventually take the place of what they needed pot for. And then you can help by making sure to spend more time with their teen doing something that they like.
And of course, we need to sort of understand what your teen is going through, maybe why they're using, or how it's helping with other things they're struggling with, whether it's self-esteem or depression, anxiety, all very common issues in teenage years. So there's a very good chance that, your teen is self-medicating with the use. I will say that in the classroom setting, when I ask what the rise is about in marijuana use, often students are saying, everybody is stressed out. Everyone needs to relax. Like, this is how people are doing that. This is how teens are doing that. So that's sort of anecdotal, but it's very telling in my mind that people are using it to self-medicate. Teens are using it to self-medicate. And really, like, sort of removing the pressures to achieve, to be perfect is probably a good idea. I think teens put a lot of pressure on themselves, whether you see it or not. And if you can be one of those people who doesn't do that, this does not mean you don't have any oversight of what they're doing or don't have any expectations, but it means sort of relieving some of the pressure that you might unintentionally put on them in different ways. And obviously helping them develop different ways of coping and relaxing. And this could be spending more time with them, going on hikes, spending more time with them, playing basketball, even if maybe you don't like it, he likes it or she likes it. You go to the park, you do it, you shoot a few shots and watch them do it, something they really love. and that they want to show you. So there's a lot of ways you could sort of like help the process of them getting into more healthy coping skills.
But if it does get to a place where you really need to get help, there are many different services in New York to help with that. So just kind of in increasing levels of severity here, you can always, you or your team can always talk or text anonymously with NYC Well, which is now NYC 988. So you can call or text 988 to get some help and connection to services. The New York State Office of Addiction Services and Supports has a search feature called Find Addiction Treatment, where you can limit the geographic radius and then also limit to like which sites even have openings right now. So that's been helpful. The New York Center for Living is well known for being able to help adolescents with addiction, even with co-occurring psychiatric issues. And then if you need residential treatment, one of the programs that we've encountered before is Newport Academy, and they have a pretty good reputation for helping with substance abuse. There are a few out there. Julie?
Sorry about that. My bad. So, you know, there is this is a no judgment zone here, but we also want to acknowledge that there may be parents who are using themselves and maybe using at home, and may want their own help with this. And there are places out there to get that. And it's okay to let your kid know that you need help with something. And obviously it has to be an age appropriate conversation. We could talk more in depth about that offline. But that, you know, you getting help will model a positive way of taking care of yourself to your child, and we'll show them that yes, maybe you are struggling, but that you can kind of take this step to take care of yourself. And then there's always sort of support groups that parents can join, whether they join that with their child or alone. But there is help out there if a parent's also sort of struggling with their use and where it is and how it's having an impact on the family system.
And these are just some of the resources that we use to gather all this information. Most of these are meta-analyses and review articles that have come out recently that are aggregating data from many years of sources. So this will be included in the email that we send out, so you don't have to like quickly write this down. Susan, I saw that several questions are coming in, and we'd be happy to take some of them.
Okay, great. One of the questions, and I think I can speak to this, is what can we do, or who or what agency do we contact about stores in our neighborhood selling weed illegally? The local police do not care. The 76th precinct told me that to my face to file a Better Business Bureau report. And that is true.
It's crazy.
But if you think about what the police are dealing with, and how, so the situation that you were talking about before, I'm a community partner for the 78th precinct. This group of teens and parents showed up to say, hey, we know exactly where this is being sold, where I got where this group of 4 or 5 teens got laced gummies. Why can't you shut it down? Like, we know they did it. And so it was explained that in order to shut a place down, you have to have proof. You can't just say that's where I bought it. You have to have an undercover cop and an undercover underage cop. So you have to have somebody buy it, and you have to have somebody witness the sale. Okay, so that's utilizing 2 resources right there. And when this happened like 6 months ago, they could, somebody would have witnessed that, they could shut it down. They could shut down the bodega for a day. Okay, so what they do is arrest the person who sold it, because why punish the bodega owner if somebody's using their job to sell weed or to sell gummies? So that was a hurdle. And back in, I think it was July, the governor signed this bill and tried to pass this law, and you've probably seen it, you know, every once in a while you'll see a poster that if you are caught selling illegally, they'll slap a sticker on, and they can not only fine the business owner, but fine the landlord. You're going to do this, you're going to rent to somebody who's selling illegal marijuana. So that sounded like a great step, right? They're not just going to arrest the person who was selling, but they can fine $10,000 to the business owner and maybe even the landlord. So I talked to recently the folks at the NYPD, and I said, well, this is a great step. Have you seen this implemented? And the people I talked to basically said, no, there's 300 bodegas in the 78th precinct alone. How do they set up these operations and make that happen? So that's my answer to that. What can we do? You can keep calling, you can keep calling, your assembly member and all of those other people. But that's kind of the background on why it's just not so easy to point to high society on 7th Avenue and get them shut down because they're selling weed illegally to kids. So,
and Julie, you had a theory about that too. About
I mean,
the speed of.
Listen, they started cropping up, and I don't blame them because they wanted to establish their clientele early on, and they were getting ready to have their licenses, and then the state is incredibly sluggish with giving out the licenses. So they were trying to sort of establish themselves legitimately at first in preparation for getting their license, but it never happened. I don't know why the state isn't giving out the licenses. I mean, it shouldn't just be 11 dispensaries at this point of the 8,000 places that are selling weed. But it's a huge problem. I don't think, as you said, Susan, the city is not putting a lot of effort into it. And if they did, it would require a lot, that the resources that they don't have. There is an Office of Cannabis Management. I think they're involved in the licensing process, but I don't really know what else they do. And I don't know if you could call them and make complaints either, but it's a concerning situation, and there's no enforcement at all.
And I think that if the state were faster and more efficient at sending out legal licenses and then regulating the products in the legal license, there would be less of a market for the illegal products in the bodega. That's what I'm hoping for anyway.
I mean, but do remember that if these are licensed and there's some sort of oversight, they're still not supposed to be selling to anyone under 21.
Right.
So focusing on this as being teens, they're still not supposed to be able to get it. So the bodega will have a demand, regardless whether or not you issue all these extra licenses. Okay, happy talk. Okay, given the alarming data about that we looked at, how do we get middle schools in particular to incorporate this information? And Julie, you might have some because you do work with schools. What's being done already, and what can we do that's more?
Absolutely. This is what I do. I basically push into classrooms and talk about this topic and other topics as well, as a part of like a 6-session mental health curriculum that I do. But a lot of schools don't have access to this, and it's really important. And it's very important to spend at least a couple of sessions and following up on this particular topic, because it's such a it's a big issue for schools. A lot of, and maybe, your teens have told you this, but a lot of kids come in very, very high and very inattentive and very sort of out of it for most of the day. Schools are really struggling with it. And yes, I've gotten many, many requests for this particular workshop. So, and I've tried to do as much as I can, but you're right. There's, I'm wondering if the social workers that are embedded in the schools can be trained to do more of this work, and talk more in a classroom setting, and be able to sort of like spread the word about the facts. Because I think even when I was like building these kinds of presentations, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is like a real problem that I didn't know the extent of.
Exactly.
And so people need this level of education, and it needs to be done in the right way in the classroom. It can't be done like this exactly, because kids don't usually pay attention to things like this, but I've incorporated a lot of activities, a lot of quizzes, a lot of things that elicit responses from students, and really engage them. So I wish I had an answer. It's just more schools need to make this a priority and use their mental health staff in the right way.
Maybe more
Right.
parents need to be asking administration for this specifically.
Yes.
Yeah,
And,
for sure.
and maybe even the CEC for District 15 is really on top of a lot of different topics. So that maybe we share this with the District 15 CEC and see what, you know, can they bring you back to do one of these district wide for
Great.
parents. So
Yeah. Julie and I
next,
already talked about making it a road show, so
Yeah,
it's a road show.
let's do it.
Is the damage from vaping marijuana similar to that of vaping other nicotine products?
So as far as I know, don't quote me on this, and I can get back to you about this, but they're similar, but that the EVALI, like that acute lung thing that happens, is sort of isolated to marijuana use and a certain liquid that thickens the substance that they're smoking, they're using to vape. And so that solvent basically causes the EVALI. So I think that particular acute lung situation is isolated to vaping marijuana liquid, if that makes any sense. But I don't know like the subtle differences between the health outcomes of vaping marijuana and vaping tobacco, I'll be honest with you.
same. Sorry, I can't
Um,
answer that.
And this goes back to the communication. You were great at saying, here's how to talk to teens. And maybe this is something you can talk about, Julie, because you were hands-on with students. But what are some good ways that teens can then say, you know, just say no, to go back to the 80s when they just said, just say no, that doesn't work. We know that doesn't work. But lines they can use, I want my brain cells, anything, any taglines or one-liners that they can do to just say no.
Yeah, Mandi and I were talking about this, like really substance use prevention has been so terrible. No one's found a very good way to talk about this or to prevent young people from using. I think, as we talked about, their brains are naturally inclined to just experiment and see how test things out. But Mandi, what were we saying? That the idea that you don't look great when you're smoking, right? You look kind of dumb.
Yeah.
Is like a
So
good
right.
way to
They're
approach.
like, well, you look really dumb when you're high. Like teens can't really think about, hey, 10, 15 years from now, I might have less income in my job than I would like, but they do care about looking dumb. But I haven't seen the research on how effective that actually is. But it feels to me like that is something that would resonate.
Yeah. And I was also thinking, also not research backed at all, but just a gut reaction to the things that don't work, is sort of talking about how maybe the marijuana industry is kind of casting aside their importance, or the teens' importance, or like sort of taking advantage of them and duping them a little bit by not being clear about the potential health impact of marijuana on them. So kids don't like to be duped, adolescents don't like to be duped. So if they feel that way, maybe they'll have a gut reaction of being like, oh no, I'm not going to do something that someone's trying to trick me into. Again, not research backed, but I could see how that approach might work.
Mm-hmm.
And I just put in the chat, excuse me for sneezing, that you can focus lobbying on city council members instead of trying to get the police to do something. So
Good point.
Colleen posted a reach out to Gail Brewer's office, so that might be helpful. Can we organize a parent protest in front of some of these places? You can. I don't think they frankly, I don't think they do much good since we talked about, unless you want to get a council member to back that, or that might be helpful. A lot of protests going on. I'm not sure how much good those are doing. Some parents I know prefer to supply their kids with safe weed. please reiterate why this is not a good idea.
Yeah, I've heard this too. And, in some ways I can understand that from the harm reduction standpoint. If a parent feels that they have a good and safe supply of weed and they can be sure that at least it's not laced with fentanyl. The problem with that is that you are tacitly communicating your approval of them using pot in that way. And even when you say, I don't like this, but I'm going to give it to you this way, you're still communicating that, in an indirect sort of way. So again, I can understand it as like a first step just to get them from stop using really dangerous stuff that they might have picked up off the street or high potency stuff. You can be sure that what they're using is, lower potency, but I would still be moving towards, this is not a long-term solution. What do you think, Julie?
Yeah, I echo that. I think it could be a good sort of harm reduction first step, and give you the peace of mind that they're not going to be like become ill or be seriously injured short term, but also sort of keeping in mind that the long-term effects that we spoke about, right, are still going to be there. I'm not sure, and this is a very particular circumstance, but what the potency is of that weed that they are smoking, and how often they're smoking it. But I could see, as Mandi said, that this could be a good first step to other conversations about the impact of use and reducing use or stopping use, and sort of reflecting on how use is impacting their motivation, their academics, their wanting to socialize. These are all conversations that really open a kid up, I think, to thinking more broadly about the impact.
Yep. And I want to talk a little bit about this. This sentiment also comes up when you're talking about alcohol, right? Where parents are like, well, if he's like drinking in my house, then at least I know he's like not out on the streets, or maybe like if he drinks with the family, then he'll get it out of his system and is less likely to be addicted later on. But we have research to show that in alcohol, that's not true. The more that they use in teen use, just like marijuana, the more they use in teen use, the more likely they are to actually be binge drinkers or addicted drinkers, addicted drug users later in life. So you're not forestalling that future by allowing them to do it in your home.
Exactly. Are there any downsides for teens using CBD?
I mean, as far as I know, CBD it really doesn't contain the psychoactive property. Like it doesn't get you high, although some people say it makes me feel relaxed. The problem with CBD is it's not regulated at all, as far as I know. So we don't know the exact potency or how it's being produced. It's not really regulated. But people are usually using it like topically as a cream for like muscle ache or pain. I don't know how anyone else is using it though, in terms of like smoking or vaping. I don't think that's really a thing. I'm not going to say, yeah, like everyone should be rubbing CBD oil over their bodies or ingesting it in an oil in some way. But what I do know is the content of THC is very trace or non-existent in CBD. And people have said that it has some positive effects as a topical solution or ingested orally. But I can't give any guidance about yes or no to teenagers. I don't even know if there's a lot of research on that or any at all, but we can look into it.
Yep, agreed.
Okay, here, this goes back to, and I think you touched upon this, but just to reiterate, what are some good ways to communicate to a teen that you don't want them to use marijuana when the other parent does habitually?
That is a hard scenario for sure. What did you say, Julie?
It's complex. I mean,
Sure.
Very hard question. But also, let's go back to the age of legal marijuana use is 21, and it's 21 for a reason, because we believe it's 21 for a reason because, we are adults and we are, our brains are developed, and that we can use casually without the impact it might have on you if you were to use. So I think you could lean back on the science, right? Lean on the science and say, adults using are very different than teens using. I don't know if that sounds right, but that would be one way to approach it.
Mhm.
I think
There's
that's
always going to be some aspect of do what I say, not what I do. And of course, it's going to be complicated by whatever factors are going into whether you like the fact that the other parent is using it or not using it, whether that parent feels okay about it or not. I mean, those are hard family dynamic sorts of situations. And frankly, if you can get help from a family therapist or something to help you figure out how to navigate that situation, that would probably be really helpful for you.
Yeah. And then this next question is kind of it takes a village question. Any tips on how to handle if your kid tells you their friends are vaping, smoking, and even selling gummies? My kid is terrified he'll get caught as the snitch. And like, where do you want to say, hey, Billy's dad or Billy is doing this at school. I don't want to do it. And then you feel like, do I owe it to Billy's dad or mom to bring that up with them? So do you snitch?
Also a tough one. I mean, being a snitch is really difficult when you're a teenager, being in that position when you really need your friends, you want your friends, you don't want to lose them. How you act is super important, and how people view you. Like, we get it. And also, at the same time, you could maybe he or she can think about it in terms of their friend's safety, right? Selling and using at high rates is unsafe. I mean, selling drugs is not a very safe thing to do, no matter how you're doing it. It can get very complicated, the dynamics. It involves money. It involves people owing people something, negotiating socially in a way that's not doesn't come naturally to teenagers. So maybe if this person can think about that they might be protecting their friend by saying something, you could sort of reframe it a little bit. I'm not saying that that's going to change everything, but it could be a good reframe.
Yeah, for sure.
Where do you get trustworthy fentanyl strips? No idea.
Ooh, I actually looked that up for this and promptly forgot. It exists and it is legal in New York. I found out that some states actually don't. It is illegal to use fentanyl strips, which seems crazy to me. But it is legal in New York, and there was a source for it, but I will have to get that information back to you.
And following up, New York-Presbyterian and Brooklyn Public Library were doing Narcan trainings. And I emailed my contact at NYP. We did our last one for the year, but I think we will do more in Q1, and
Great.
they will keep me posted.
Awesome.
So
Sounds good.
yeah. If you find a vape or cart or a pre-roll or other marijuana products in or around your child's belonging, what do? How would you address that?
I mean, that is one of the risk signs that your teen is actually using themselves. And I think that it gives you a good opportunity for starting those conversations of where you're gathering information, you're staying non-judgmental, you're asking them what they know and what's going on in their social lives. And then when you have an in, you say, hey, I found this, and what can you tell me about it? How much are you using? Why are you using it? What do you get out of it? You're not in trouble. I just want to know. I want to understand. Anything else to add, Julie?
No, yes, just the non-judgmental approach and the sort of shying away from punishment or telling them what to do is probably the best way to start at least initial conversations. Even though you probably want to be like, don't do that, like almost going the opposite.
What's wrong with you?
Right.
Yeah.
Like literally tell yourself, I'm going to do the opposite of like what my gut is telling me right now. And that's probably the best approach. I know that sounds weird, but in this case, it's sort of true.
Somebody on the group posted the free naloxone. Thank you. Test strips and where to order them. So
good.
You get free ones. So that's
wonderful.
What we have to follow up with.
We can send that out in our follow-up email with the slides.
Yes. Is there any safe dose for a weekly habitual use for a person who is 21? How tall are they? How big are they?
Weekly, they're using once a week.
That's what the question is.
Have they used, I'm wondering if they've used before the age of 21 too. Is this like, since they were 15, they used once a week, which is like a
When they
very
started when they were
unusual
21.
user, I think. That's hard. I don't know, Mandy. This is
We
a
don't
hard
know. I
answer.
mean, Julie and I were talking about like 5 milligrams being sort of the standard unit of, potency or like marijuana use, which, is a standard gummy. But I don't think anybody has been able to establish what a safe amount is. Even at 21, you're still going to experience some of the disruption to development that's still happening in your brain until 25 or 30. I definitely had a 15-year-old ask me once, so how soon can I start using again? At 21? I'm like, no, 25. He's like, dude, that's never gonna happen. So anyway, telling somebody who's 21 that they can't use pot until like 25 or 30. But it is true. You're going to see those like long-term effects, even at 21 and older, but I don't know that we have an established safe amount.
Great. There's a long question that looks more like an article, not your grandmother's marijuana, rising THC concentrations in cannabis. And somebody wants to share, they would love to share, Julie, your information with their school. So we can send that out if you're interested. Your secondary job will be never seeing your family again and all of these. Last question, how many milligrams is high potency?
So there, I don't know if there's like an actual number of milligrams, but anything that's like in the 50s or 100s, which is very, very high potency. But as Mandi said, anything in like the 10-5s would be like a dose of marijuana that would, for a person who's never taken it, would give a high without an extreme high. And I'm saying that very generally because everyone's going to react to it differently. But once it gets past that, it becomes, I don't know if that's the threshold for high potency, but I will definitely get back to you about what exactly that means. And like, if there's a definition of what high potency means, or like where that starts. I don't have an exact number.
Yeah.
But I will let you know.
And somebody else posted a link to the distribution of free Narcan kits.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
That is awesome. So wrapping things up, unless there's no other last minute questions. Oh my gosh, so much to chew on.
Yeah, for sure.
This is not mother's.
I already had a lot of information, which led me to want to do this talk in the first place. But and Julie said she had the same experience. Just the diving into the research to set, this webinar up. There's so many more things that I learned, and there's more research coming out all the time. It is constantly changing as we start learning more and more about what it's actually doing to brains.
Well, thank you for your time, your effort, your beautiful slides, and just trying to kind of take some of the oxygen out of the scary air so that it's not, I think having a good relationship with your kids with you can tell me anything.
It's always the first step.
A great first step. And trying not to, even with the scary information, jump to oh my God, you can't do that. And to have conversations with kids. I do like Lisa DeMore and her ways of talking to kids and
me too.
Trying to pile it on. And I think the other thing that I got out of what you were saying was we expect so much from our kids. We put so much pressure on our kids. And to quote Lenore Skenazy, let them go play and do things when they're younger so they have these outlets. So they know how to have more resilience, and that will give them lots of tools throughout their life. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. Thanks for having us.
Excellent.